Hey there, true crime fans. Welcome back to For Criming Out Loud and our bedtime series called Crime Me to Sleep. We've been reading Buried Beneath the Boarding House, and this is episode 10. So if you're new here, please make sure to subscribe so you can go into the playlists and start the book from the beginning. Let's get into episode 10 of Buried Beneath the Boarding House. Back in business. Despite all of the prohibitions against Dorothea operating a boarding house or caring for the elderly again, the needs of the state soon outweighed the rule of law. Social workers had already been quietly depositing homeless, addicted, and otherwise hopeless cases on Dorothea from the moment that her doors reopened. And things only got busier once she had the whole operation up and running. The new boarding house was considerably smaller than the first, but the turnover was considerably higher, and given that Dorothea's main requirement from her tenants was for them to just stay as long enough for her to redirect their benefit payments to her address, this worked out nicely for her designs. She was the last stop for people on the lowest rung of society, the last hint of a safety net before the homeless vanished entirely, never to return, and she used that position to prey on them. More than $5,000 was soon being deposited into her account each month in the form of dozens of different checks, and she could easily have slipped back into high society if it weren't for the ongoing stigma attached to her name. Dorothea began to schedule the absences of her residents. Alcoholics were the most common addicts in her care, and for the vast majority of them, recovery wasn't even a consideration. All of the mail to the house was intercepted by Dorothea before most of her guests had even woken from their stupor. She extracted any money or checks from the post and handed out a stipend to her residents. It was through this money that she was able to control when they would be arrested. All that she had to do to ensure that a drunk and a disorderly charge stuck to one of her residents was to pay them out just enough so that their latest binge would push them over the edge into belligerence. She had the distance to the local bars and the drinking speed of her residents worked out. After she'd sent them off with cash in their pockets, it was a simple matter to call in an anonymous tip to the police about their behavior. And like clockwork, they'd be picked up and would face 30 days of jail time. 30 days when Dorothea could rent out their room to somebody else while still collecting the jailed residents' benefit payments. She was careful not to have the same residents in constant trouble, but looking at it from the perspective of a criminal enterprise, it's quite obvious that she was running through a rotation based on how regularly each individual was up in front of a judge. But at the time, the government workers who were meant to be overseeing the care of her residents considered it to be a minor miracle that she kept them out of trouble for as long as she did. Despite this constant turnover of bodies, Dorothea never managed to develop a bad reputation among the social workers that she encountered. They were well aware that she was taking on cases that nobody else wanted anything to do with, and if she lost some, or even most of them, then that was just inevitability doing its work. Some people were beyond saving. For the rest, there was Dorothea. She handed out homemade tamales to the homeless in the street outside her house and found little jobs for them to do in exchange for cash. She prepared lavish meals for her residents, and the few that stayed on with her described life in the house as being like a constant party. Alcohol and drugs were strictly prohibited due to the nature of many of her residents' issues, but anything else was fair game, and the long days that would normally have worn an addict down were filled with chatter and games. Despite it never being her intention, Dorothea collected a loyal family of long-term residents who adored her and would do anything for her, up to and including lying to their own social workers to keep their place in her good graces. This was a problem. It wasn't that Dorothea didn't appreciate having a support network of people looking out for her interests, but she had learned from her previous encounters with the law, and she now understood that those same people would gradually become aware of the patterns in her behavior and the objectionable choices that she made. The longer they were in the house, the more that they would see, and the more that they saw, the more of a threat they became to Dorothea. Worse still, every client who lingered in her care was another room that she couldn't use for the never-ending parade of homeless addicts who were just passing through. She was enjoying her $5,000 a month income, but she wanted more. She'd always wanted more. She'd lost everything during her last arrest. All of her finery and her station in society had been stripped from her, and she was too old and too tired to move to some new town and start all over again. The world was becoming a smaller place by the 1980s, and the stories that she had been able to leave at the city limits earlier in her life would follow after her if she tried to flee now. The ones who stayed trended a little older than her usual residents. They were getting too old for a life of constant motion, and in the comfort of Dorothea's home, they found the kind of retirement that they had been longing for. Dorothy Miller and Benjamin Fink were the first to put roots down, settling into their prospective rooms. Dorothy Miller was 64 years old, and she thought that she had found a kindred spirit in Dorothea. The older woman was a Native American who had developed a drinking problem early in life, one that plagued her through to these later days. She had suffered heartbreak after heartbreak through the years, losing her young lover in a similarly tragic way to Dorothea's invented story. Despite being looked down on for her drinking problem, she was still a romantic at heart, with endless poems committed to memory and ready to be recited at a moment's notice. Dorothea didn't know how to respond to the woman's interest in her life, and found that her usual camouflage of tragedies just seemed to entice Dorothy further instead of putting her off. In Dorothy, Dorothea saw herself through a dark mirror, another version of herself with almost the same name, who'd actually been born into an ethnic minority, who'd actually suffered terrible loss in her life, and who was still capable of such deep and profound emotion that just a few stanzas of a poem were enough to bring a tear to her eye. Her whole worldview was alien and dangerously antithetical to Dorothea's own, and she insisted on sharing as much time as possible with her landlady, sitting out on the porch smoking her hand-rolled cigarettes whenever Dorothea tried to escape her into the garden. Importantly for Dorothea, the old woman suffered from night terrors as a result of her traumatic life and had been prescribed a not inconsiderable dosage of sleeping pills to allow her to get some rest. It was with these pills that Dorothea carefully dosed Dorothy's cocktails up in her private apartment, the only place that alcohol was allowed in the building. It wasn't a particularly complex trap, but the bait was undeniably attractive. Offering an alcoholic drink had to be the easiest scam she had ever run. As the residents who worked the hardest to be actively involved in Dorothea's life, this new sister she had acquired was the most likely to provide her with trouble down the line. So it was almost inevitable that she was the first to draw the old woman's lethal attention. But it actually took Dorothea quite some time to successfully murder the woman. She had built up considerable resistance to the cocktail of drugs that Dorothea was pouring down her throat over the years. So like the previous victims, she fell ill rather than dying outright. Of course, the sick fell into Dorothea's care within the house, allowing her to finish the job. But it still gave the other residents more time to become aware of the situation, rather than Dorothy cleanly vanishing as intended. At the age of 55, Benjamin wasn't drastically older than the usual transient residents, but he was more devoted to his own recovery from alcoholism than the majority. He would eat communal meals with the rest of the house, but was otherwise quite solitary. He suffered from bouts of ill health after developing pneumonia while living on the streets. His lungs had never fully recovered from the damage, and he would often be forced to take to his bed for days at a time if he developed even so much as a sniffle. Dorothea would bring his meals to him in his room, even though it was against her own rules for anyone to eat away from the group. And in that privacy, she was free to dose his food and force it down his throat as she saw fit. When his health worsened as a result of the drugging, Dorothea loudly announced to the home that she was taking him upstairs to take care of him, just as she had with Dorothy. But unlike Dorothy, the response was overwhelming apathy. Most of the transient residents didn't even know Ben because of his solitary nature, and it was rapidly approaching the point where none of them could recall Dorothy either. In much the same way as her previous victims, Dorothea killed Benjamin with a drug overdose. The processing of each body replicated her preparation of Everson's corpse. They were sewn into bed covers, wrapped up in plastic sheeting, and prepared for disposal within hours of their deaths. But then they went no further. News did not travel so swiftly to Dorothea's ears as it used to. Her contacts within the police department had grown ever more distant since her return to civilian life. But even she had heard about the John Doe found at the side of the river out by the Garden Highway. If they had found Everson, they would find anyone else that she dumped like that, and eventually evidence would start to point back to her. All it would take was the identification of a single body to tie all of the corpses to her guest house. She needed these bodies to disappear. All of the homeless population of Sacramento, the hulking alcoholic known only as Chief was considered to be one of the most unwelcome. The one that shop owners would call the police to move along instead of trying to chase out themselves. The one who everyone knew had a criminal history. He existed at the crossroads between the homeless people that Dorothea loved to help and the ex-cons that she loved to exploit. Most importantly to her, he loathed the police with a passion and would stonewall them whenever they encountered him. Others looked on Dorothea's adoption of the man as her personal handyman as a kind of madness. The natural end to her charity work stretched too far. They couldn't believe that a kind-hearted old woman could handle a hardened criminal like Chief. They fully expected to hear that he had brutalized and robbed this beloved figure in the local community. Yet, as the days rolled by and nothing happened, the neighbors began to relax. The lumbering form of Chief became a regular addition to the usual workers in Dorothea's garden, and gradually he became a part of the background noise, just like so many of the strange things that Dorothea did. With his physical strength, he became Dorothea's go-to assistant in all of her major remodeling of the garden. As they removed trees and shifted flower beds around, it was her mind directing Chief's huge hands. Sometimes she would have him working out there until late into the night, laying down the foul-smelling fertilizer that stank out the entire neighborhood with the stench of rotting flesh until the soil had been turned over. For all that Dorothea was a kindly soul, she had a territorial streak when it came to her garden. She wouldn't allow the neighbors' children onto her lawn and would cuss a streak if anyone stepped into her flower beds. Words that nobody would have expected a mild-mannered old landlady to bellow down from her porch to the street would redden people's ears. Both Dorothy and Benjamin were buried in the back garden under a flower bed. There was no way that Chief could have buried those bodies without knowing what they were, any more than there was any way that Dorothea could have been in any way unclear in her instructions to him about it. They were partners in crime from the moment that she let him know about those bodies. He was the muscle that she needed to dispose of the bodies, and she was the mastermind behind the whole operation, paying him a stipend out of the checks that she collected each week to fund his drinking habit. Time kept rolling on, and the money came rolling in. Troublesome tenants began vanishing at a much increased rate, unless they could be relied upon to find their way to jail with regularity, and Dorothea began trawling the local bars to look for new guests, just as she had in the early days. It got to the stage that she couldn't fill the rooms as fast as she was emptying them. The party atmosphere in the house began to turn colder as the place became increasingly empty and silent. Day after day, Chief came out of the house with more dirt dug up from the basement floor. Dorothea was replacing the dirt floor with concrete to keep the place cooler through the long summers, according to the story she spun for the neighbors. Yet, there seemed to be an awful lot more dirt than would be required to simply replace the surface of the basement floor. It was almost as though they were digging deep holes in the basement rather than just clearing the surface. It didn't really matter, of course. Once the concrete was poured, nobody would ever know for certain what had been done down there. With her routine now well established, Dorothea no longer had any reason to hold back from her murderous plotting. Chief could handle the cleanup. All that she needed were easy victims to keep the whole process flowing. For that, she turned her attention back to her old contacts in the care industry. If she could collect people who were already on the verge of death, as Benjamin had been, then it made her job as a murderer that much easier, and as an added bonus, the people in extreme enough ill health to fall into the state-provided care system were already in receipt of the highest levels of benefits. On August 19, 1986, Betty Palmer was due for a regular checkup at the doctor, but she never showed up. She had recently moved into the boarding house on F Street, but unlike the previous tenants who were accustomed to being treated like dirt, she had come from a fairly stable background before mounting medical costs had robbed her of her home. When she discovered that Dorothea opened her mail and cashed her checks, she immediately leapt into action, contacting the relevant department and ensuring that all future checks required photographic identification to bank them. Betty hadn't gone so far as to report Dorothea to the police. She could understand why some of the other boarders required that kind of handling that Dorothea was trying to inflict on her, but she certainly hadn't lived 77 years handling her own finances just for some stranger to elbow her aside and take over now. The two of them had some terse words about that situation throughout the weeks, with Dorothea insisting that none of her residents would get special treatment out of a desire for fairness. Dorothea had no idea how many people Betty was talking to about the situation. She had no control over where the woman went or who she went with. The whole scam in the boarding house only worked if Dorothea could maintain full control over all the moving pieces. And Betty was a wild card. Dorothea couldn't tell which way she would jump. It was unacceptable. She invited Betty up to her parlor on the night of the 18th of August to have a few drinks and talk things through. Convinced that Dorothea wanted to bury the hatchet, Betty accepted the invitation, the last mistake she would ever make. Over the course of several hours, Dorothea plied her with cocktails full of sleeping pills and sweetened the medicine with all the sweet words that Betty wanted to hear, promising her the world and offering up all the apologies that the old woman wanted to hear. By the time that she was hustled down to her room to get changed and settled, Betty was feeling quite blissfully inebriated. With numb fingers, she fumbled out of her clothes and into her white nightgown. She collapsed before she could even reach her bed. When the room fell silent, Dorothea and her loyal henchmen let themselves in with the master key and set to work. The shoddy work of the previous corpses would be insufficient for Betty. It was quite possible that she would have people coming looking for her, people who already knew about the conflict with Dorothea and her landlady's motive to dispose of her. This body would have to be completely unidentifiable. Together, Dorothea and Chief set to work, spreading plastic sheeting across the floor and bringing out the handyman tools that the man had never touched before, despite his long tenure in that job. With saws and chisels, they cut through the old woman's neck in a sluice of arterial spray and removed her head. Next came the hands and then the feet, along with a good portion of the lower legs. Any part of her body that might make for easy identification was removed and bagged up separately to be buried somewhere outside of the city limits. Only the unrecognizable mass of the old woman's torso remained, ready to join the other two victims in the garden, now that the more convenient disposal option of the basement had been sealed off with concrete. Chief roamed off with the smaller pieces on that same night, but it wouldn't be until sunset on the 19th that they had an opportunity to move the main block of flesh into the garden. That was when they encountered the first real problem of the operation. The neighbors were out in their back gardens. The scorching Sacramento weather of that year had pushed everyone with a social life into more nocturnal patterns. Barbecues and clinking beer bottles were everywhere that Dorothea turned. The back garden had gone from the perfect refuge to Grand Central Station. There was no possibility of doing some late-night digging without it attracting all manner of unwanted attention. But on the street at this time of night, there was practically nobody around, one car rolling by every hour at most. Even if somebody was going about their nighttime business, they were unlikely to say a thing about anything they saw, probably off conducting their own illicit affairs. Working in tandem, Dorothea and Chief dug a shallow grave for the torso just a few feet away from the pavement in front of the house and covered it over just as quickly. If any passerby saw them, then they never came forward to report the odd activities. To mark the grave of the troublesome woman and cover the freshly turned earth, Dorothea dragged a statue of St. Francis of Assisi into place. For a few weeks they lay low, actually conducting the business of the boarding house without any funny activities. But when it became apparent that nobody had reported the old woman missing, Dorothea relaxed and went to cash her usual checks, which was when she finally encountered the problem with Betty's payments. Without identification to prove that she was Betty, she could no longer deposit Betty's checks. She played it off with a laugh about her faltering memory and came back the next day with exactly what she needed: Betty's ID, doctored to have Dorothea's picture in place of the dead woman's. With the added layer of security in place, the government didn't give a second thought to continuing to issue checks to Betty, even though they were out of touch, and Betty's near-constant doctor's appointments for the bad health that drove her to Dorothea's boarding house provided the perfect excuse whenever a social worker swung by to check on her welfare. Within a week, all of Betty's belongings were fenced, and the room was up for rent once more. Business rolled on as usual. That wraps up episode 10 of Buried Beneath the Boarding House. If you're enjoying this bedtime book series, please make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Thank you guys so much for being here. I really, really appreciate all your support in our new series, Crime Me to Sleep. Until next time, good night.